Today I'm with Martin Gisby. Martin, we've known each other for quite a few years now. Worked together at Jazz and recently reconnected. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself with your current role and the kind of work you do.
Sure. Thanks, Marcus. The background to my roles over the last 15 years have always been related to market access. That's the topic that I'm passionate about, whether it be working within a pharmaceutical company or in a consultancy house, or most recently now working as an independent, market access consultant. So it's good to have a catch up and maybe cover some of the things which are happening or might be interesting to developers at the moment on the European side for market access.
Yeah, I mean, that was something we were talking about previously. I mean, in today's landscape, what do you see as some of the, I guess the key considerations that developers should be aware of that can impact them and, from a market access point of view in Europe?
If you're talking to anyone in a market access team, they're always going to say, yeah, it's complicated, and truly it is complicated, and every country is different. But there's principles around it, which if you focus on the principles, other things will tend to go, the way you need them to go, and you won't, miss things which you come to regret, later on in development. And I think, especially if you're at that earlier stage, phase one, phase two, probably part of a small team, and you don't have the time to think through all the details and the processes in Europe. There's a few things that you can just, focus on and keep in mind. And that, the first one there is really about the ability for the therapy you're developing to demonstrate effectiveness, and maybe this sounds really obvious, the ability to show clinical value and clinical effectiveness. But the tricky bit is that, the different payers in different countries see value in different ways, and ultimately in most European countries, payers will make the decisions around reimbursement, market access, and price for a product. Yeah. So I'd say that, focusing on that clinical value from the start, which everyone will be doing anyway, but in the payer's eyes is going to be critical, and that's thinking about, will payers recognize certain endpoints, and will you be able to show comparative effectiveness? Because most European health technology assessments are going to look at a standard of care, the clinical standard of care in the market today, and you're really aiming to show comparative effectiveness versus that standard of care to get a good HTA outcome. Okay. And if you want to be successful across Europe more broadly, you're going to have to be able to deliver information that cost effectiveness payers want to complete their assessments, and that is effectively, a judgment on value for money, and they all have their own methods and approaches for this, but it's, that health economic assessment needs to be in your thinking from relatively early on. So that, that concept of preparedness for HTA, I would say is, the core thing to focus on. And that was always at a country level, although now the hot topic is from January in 2025, European HTA, formerly known as the European Joint Clinical Assessment, the JCA, will kick off, and it's ultimately going to cover all products, but the first products proper will be going through from January in the coming year.
There's a lot of it's all over LinkedIn, and there's lots of articles coming out on it at the moment. So aware of it, certainly. I mean, I think perhaps it would be helpful to get your view on why it's been introduced. I guess you've got all these countries across Europe with different standards of assessment. So I think I kind of know the answer, but this sort of, I guess, standardization. Perhaps we could just tell us a little bit more about your understanding of what it will hope to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, it's been in discussion for a long time, and a lot of people are of the opinion that it would never actually become real.
Yeah.
It was just a talking point. But it is happening. It's legislated for within the European Union. And the proposition, and you could argue whether this proposition will be reality or not, but the proposition for the JCA is that it aims to harmonise those clinical assessments of pharmaceuticals, which currently happen across most of the member states, and trying to introduce, a more streamlined single assessment to support market access for new therapies. And that sounds in principle like, a good idea when you're sitting away from the detail, but there's a big question mark around, is this actually going to reduce the redundancies that pharmaceutical companies have by doing lots of HTAs, or is it simply going to create an extra layer and more complexity, and doing things at both the European level and individual member states, either consecutively or even at the same time? And that's a big question around how will that play out. But what we do know at the moment is that the focus is on the clinical effectiveness, the evaluation of clinical effectiveness, safety, therapeutic value, and the aim is that it's going to be applied to all new medicines by 2030. What we also know is that it's not an economic judgment. So the economic value or the pricing considerations aren't going to be included at a European level. That's going to continue to be done at the country level.
Okay. And there's, in terms of the focus, initially, is it on certain therapy areas, or is it? I'm sure I was reading something where there's cancer's got a priority in an advanced therapy. Is that right?
Yeah. So oncology medicines, not 100% of medicines seeking an oncology indication, but certain types of molecules. So that will be the first wave or the start of the process in January 2025. Then following that, there will be an introduction for orphan medicines, and then there will be that will expand to all medicines by 2030.
Thinking about pharmaceutical companies and their awareness of this coming down the line, pretty soon. What considerations must they have?
I think it's going to be very different depending on the maturity of that company, that the size of that company, because there's a combination of what are the capabilities you need. Do you have those in-house, or do you go out externally to get them? And also, how big are different teams in different part of the company that will now need to talk together more than they used to. And that's very different to a company that's taken its first product and thinking about Europe, and they're just trying to understand, some of the strategic decisions or strategic questions they might have to ask around, does JCA put them in a more favourable or a more challenging situation than what would have happened in the past?
Yeah.
So it will be different for different companies. I think you could, what's the things we could call out? We could say being able to address different timelines. HTA effectively starts earlier, and in parallel with the regulatory submission. And that's
which is always what everyone's talking about, getting things done earlier down the line. Yeah.
Yes, which sounds good, but it's that's quite tricky internally to align yourselves, especially when you're aligning across multiple countries, especially if you have a number of affiliates across those countries, and so they're trying to understand what's the goal and what's the approach for the European joint clinical assessment. There is also that more complexity, certainly for a pharma company, around potentially doing EU HTA or EU JCA, plus the preparation, or actually maybe even starting those local HTAs, again, simultaneously in parallel. And there's also going to be a different level of evidence requested for JCA. So generally more transparency around the data and the methodologies around studies that
Yeah.
pharmaceutical companies have used, as part of the clinical study program.
Okay.
And I think the big one is making sure that there's absolutely sort of in-step understanding and alignment between the regulatory team and the market access team about what are they putting into their submissions. Are they consistent? Are they using the same data sets? How, if they're cutting data differently, why are they cutting it differently? Because these will be both being reviewed simultaneously by
Okay.
European groups.
Okay. And so, I guess practically, what strategies would you foresee that companies would be adopting? At this point, how practically would they adapt to this to be successful ultimately?
In some ways, the core principles I
Put
don't
you on
think
the spot
change.
there.
What was that?
So putting you on the spot there.
Oh, sorry. I thought you said let's stop there.
Oh no. Good.
Yeah, I think many of the principles are going to stay the same, which is that the ability to demonstrate value is still the core tenet here, and the
Yeah.
ability to show comparative effectiveness, and value against a standard of care. That is still a core strategy. I think the challenge strategically is understanding which is the standard of care for
Yeah.
the JCA when they're covering all the countries, or probably more likely, especially for oncology, how many standard of
Yeah.
cares are they going to try and review? Because the onus
Is
is on the
there?
pharmaceutical company to be able
Yeah.
to prepare and submit that information.
Are there lead countries here that they're looking at? I mean, obviously, I know there's certain countries where they're traditionally seen as providing significant guidance on how these processes work, but there are certain countries they're taking the lead from in terms of defining this.
It's an interesting question, and the idea is that this is trying to provide more of an equal playing field for Europe for its
Yeah.
assessment of medicines. However, you're right that there have been some, quite dominant HTA groups that other countries will look at. I mean, what we can say at this point is that there was a pilot done and a number of PICOs, which was, the outline for, how the assessment will be conducted, were completed, and there were multiple standards of care. So, it
Right.
was rather, too many rather than too few from the point of view
Yeah.
of trying to review. What that does mean is that there has to be a core clinical program, which there'll be some strategic decisions needed around which standard of care to pick, and being mindful of those larger countries by both population, but also
Yeah.
by their purchasing power of pharmaceuticals, is still going to be key. But there is a need to address other standards of care. But that's
Yeah.
going to have to be through indirect evidence comparison. So there is a
Yeah.
key need here for there to be capability and resource to do that additional evidence analysis, comparisons, specifically for the JCA. And unless it's a very, very clear situation in Europe with either no standard of care at all, or a very clear one or two standards of care, the likelihood is that the study is only going to be part of that
Yeah.
overall evidence package.
I think this is one of those topics we could probably sit here and talk about for several hours and probably still not come up with the right answer. But I mean, certainly the concept of it to me sounds, it's a sound concept. I can see why, this is being adopted. So I think it's something we're both, interested to follow very closely. So
As a final thought is that the expectation is, if you're a company that's early in development, you're not going to have the experts in house, and
yeah,
and you don't need to know all the answers to the questions. I think the things that I would always say is, do engage with external experts, to help you with
yeah,
your thinking, but also, engaging externally with clinical experts, engaging with the HTA groups, engaging
yeah,
with patient groups, This, for a successful market access strategy, you need to do that,
Yeah.
and it makes sense to do it earlier rather than later to inform the
Yeah,
thinking.
absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
like I said before, it comes back to the same principles of thinking about how you demonstrate value
Yeah. Yeah.
and making sure you're speaking to as many individuals as you can along the
Yeah.
development pathway, especially as you approach some of those strategic
Yeah.
decision points, especially around study programs or thinking about markets. You want to take your medicines into in the future.
Just thinking about, I know you do quite a lot of work with earlier stage biotechs and emerging companies. What's your perception of their awareness and preparation for this coming?
Um, it's hard if you're in Europe to have missed it. But of course, there's a huge amount of innovation which comes from outside of Europe now. The majority of innovation is going to come from outside of Europe and especially on the US side. And I think that bigger question of does a company want to target Europe and when and how is a bigger question than just
Yeah.
EU JCA.
Yeah.
But EU JCA would be part of the mix in thinking about what would it take to be successful in Europe.
Okay.
But that also will come back to thinking about a study program which is targeted for going as fast as you can to enter into the US
Mm-hmm.
versus having what is probably a more complex and resource intensive clinical study program which
Yeah.
gets you to Europe as well as early as you can. So I think that I think there is still just at the moment a fairly big question, especially for the smaller companies, around if Europe is possible, when and how, rather than just diving straight into what is the strategy for success in Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Martin, that's great. Fascinating stuff. Really appreciate your insight and thank you for your time.
Speak to you soon.